Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 3. I hope that this week finds you happy and healthy and not too overloaded with school stuff. We're going to go ahead and get started. This week is kind of content heavy. Um, and the reason for that is because of the shortened term, we kind of had to merge a couple of the weeks together. And I found that while the case management portion and the cultural agility piece of this course are important, I think that moving forward with the assignments, that we're going to need more time to work on that. So less reading and less um, learning, if you will, from me and more work in practice. So there is, like I said, there's a lot of content in this week, so bear with me. If you are unable to read the entirety of the articles, that's fine. There is an article in the cultural considerations module that I think is really important to read. So if you have um, time to read that versus skim it, I would highly suggest. Um, Also, something that I wanted to discuss before we get into the cultural considerations is that I am a white, cisgender, primarily straight, middle class woman. And so, what I know about cultural competency, if you will, versus somebody else from a different background, different ethnicity, is going to look very different. And so there are some things that we can apply across the board, but I do want to mention that. So if you um, learning from me versus learning from somebody who is uh, culturally diverse or different from me is going to be very different. One thing that organizations and agencies are trying to do is insurance companies only pay for certain types of services. They have a formulary, if you will. And so what that looks like is if somebody has a diagnosis, let's say of PTSD, depending on the level of care that you're working in, the insurance company is only willing to pay for certain services. And those services are not going to apply to everyone. There's been a lot of discussion over the past 10 years or so about using evidence-based treatment. So while there is evidence that supports that these treatments are beneficial for some folks, we are not applying them cross-culturally. And so there is a discussion, if you will, in the behavioral health, social work research community about utilizing evidence-based practices and having insurance companies solely pay for these services because we can't apply them to everyone. So one thing that we're going to look at here is what it means to be uh, culturally informed. So we used to call it multicultural competence or cultural competency. You may or may not have even had a class on this that looks into different populations of people that we may serve. And while that's really important, what we know about that is we can never be culturally competent enough in any other culture other than our own. Um, Unless we're going and we're living and we're vibing and we're working with these folks, we don't, even then, we will never know what it means to truly be a piece of that culture. And so we're kind of steering away from that and learning how to be more diverse and inclusive in our assessment and more learning from the patient rather than us being the um, expert or authority, if you will, and more turning it back on the patient and asking them, like, what are your thoughts about this? Um, what does your culture or your family system think about mental health? What do they, where do you draw strength from? What does your community connections look like? And so, but this lesson is really about how we ask the right questions and how we ask them differently in a way that we can collect data about the person rather than assume because there's an evidence-based treatment for whatever their diagnosis is, how we're going to treat them. So the knowledge that I am trying to share with you is that the patient is the expert. It's really not us, especially when it comes to treatment plans, care plans, what their resiliency factors and risk factors are going to look like. That is all going to be based on the patient. And so that's the kind of lens that we're focusing on here. And one other thing that I wanted to mention is that all of our experiences, our culture, how we were raised, the workplaces that we've been in, these are all going to inform the lens in which we see the world. And so um, that is certainly going to apply in how we work with people. And I think that um, truly exploring the implications or the cause and effect, if you will, of the way that we were raised, the way that the way that we think, the way that we process information, and how that is going to apply to the way we work with folks is really important. That is not something that we're going to cover in this class. I know for those of you in the BASHES program, there will be a multicultural counseling piece. For those of you who have been to ACED, you're well aware of this. You're aware of this also. And so I think that there will be more spaces for exploration into who we are, what makes up our identity. And I think that that really is an important piece. If that is not something that you have experienced in your educational process, there will be resources under the optional tab this week that you can take a look at to kind of help guide you in that process. So I'm going to share my screen here and we're going to start going over this. Let's see. Okay. Sorry if you hear my dog and my family playing outside. Let's see. Okay, there we go. So I think one thing that we have to have this general universal understanding of is what is culture. So depending on who you ask, the definition might be very different. But culture is what sets us apart or distinguishes us from other groups of folks. So this will be things like customs, religion might be a part of that, traditions, holidays that we celebrate, our beliefs and our perceptions of the world. So we, you know, many of us have our own perception that we've made of the world, but we also have this cultural understanding of the world that is very much so informed by religion, capitalism, social norms. Language is a piece of culture, as well as the way that we dress, our behaviors, sometimes even down to the way we think or our ideologies, and certainly the way that we interact with each other. Within cultures, if you will, there's also subcultures. And so these might be, you know, smaller microcosms of culture within a broader culture. Um, and moving on, how we are culturally informed. So like I said, that does not mean that we need to be experts across cultures. You may or may not have had a class where, you know, you specifically investigated certain races, certain ethnicities, and how we should provide services to those folks. And while I think a little bit about that is important, kind of this general sense, and if you feel inclined or passionate about it, reading further is okay. But what we know is that over immersing ourselves in alternative cultures and not actually being a part of that culture or speaking to actual people who live within that culture um, with the intention of being an expert, we can actually perpetuate biases. And part of the reason is because within cultures, people themselves are diverse, but also we kind of go into the therapeutic relationship with this expectation of what their culture is supposed to look like and how that informs their care. And what we know, what the research shows, is that kind of going in with a blank slate, having general knowledge, but a blank slate about specifics so that we can open up a dialogue and be able to ask questions is the best way to go about it. So to be culturally informed does mean that we're self-aware. So back to what we discussed before. So being aware of our own cultural biases, our behaviors, and our worldviews. And sometimes they'll be negative, but for the most part, they're positive or neutral. And what we know about the positive or neutral biases or worldviews that we have. We don't typically, we kind of talk about the negative biases more so than the positive ones. And what I will say to that is, um, it doesn't necessarily matter if it's, I mean, it does matter if it's negative or positive, but it is still going to impact the way that we work with people. So part of being culturally informed also means that we're willing to be flexible, we're willing to ask questions, and we're really willing to understand that we don't know everything. Um, and while sometimes it can feel comforting to go into a therapeutic relationship feeling like we're the experts, um, typically we've kind of gone through that wave of psychology and healthcare, where the patients are the experts on their own lives, whether they are from a similar culture to ours or not. And that's kind of the umbrella that we're taking with this. Asking a lot of questions. Um, so, when it comes to cross cultural work, the way that we do our assessing, and we'll move into this a little bit later in the presentation, but the way that we ask questions and how many questions we ask to inform an answer are going to be different. And so, what I know and what I do personally is when I know that I'm going to be working with someone who has an alternative identity or an alternative culture, I tend to allot more time for my assessing. And that's so I can really learn about how to best help them and have them inform the work that we do together. Not that, you know, I wouldn't be asking similar questions with somebody of a similar culture. I just think that for it to be authentic and for it to be um, very therapeutic, I need to allow space for more time. So we also don't make assumptions. We are authentic. So, you know, pretending like we're interested in something. I know that that's something that I did a lot early in my career as a way to build empathy and connection. Um, I really, like, if somebody liked football, I'd be like, oh, I like this team, and I really don't like football. I know it's kind of a silly example, but people feel that. And I think that through time, we can find ways to connect with authenticity, even with people that we don't feel like we have anything in common with. Um, so acquiring general knowledge about the cultures we serve. So some things that I think are important to know are maybe traumatic events or traumatic experiences that have happened to people as a whole. So, for example, second generation Holocaust survivors or people from the indigenous communities, they are going to have this kind of historical and community trauma, and that is certainly going to inform the way that they work with systems and authority. And so having that general knowledge and what that means and like really exploring what that means for services. Also people living in poverty, people of color, they tend to experience what's called systemic oppression. And this is being bound by and disturbed by systems. So this could be the mental health system, the incarceration system, the capitalistic system itself. And so having that general information is going to be important. Um, let's see. So something else that I wanted to mention, let me think here. So I know I'm kind of jumping around and I apologize, but I don't want to miss this. So, what we know about behavioral health recovery, so whether we're talking about substance use or mental health, it's all down to mental health. Well as um, how we can mitigate stressors. or stress itself. And so stress can be anxiety, fears, worries, hypervigilance, any of those things. So those are the three major things that we're looking at in behavioral health treatment. How can we increase social support? How can we get people more in alignment and attunement with what their purpose is, their reason for being on this earth, their reason for living, and also how do we mitigate stress? And so uh, obviously across cultures it's going to be very different. So during our assessment period, finding ways to ask these questions, um, it, we're going to get into it in a second, so I'm going to stop here. Well, let's talk about engagement first. So sometimes we'll receive referrals for treatment from therapists, doctors, social workers, community case managers, or folks themselves. And so either way, we want to always get a description of what the patient wants in the face-to-face visit. So for instance, if on the referral form it says that they want to learn how to manage just depression symptoms, we want to reiterate that and ask why they're here. So we're not going to make an assumption about why they're here. And this is across the board. This is something that I always do. Always get a first person account why the person's in treatment. Okay. Um, explaining that help is available and a positive outcome is possible. Don't make any promises. Don't tell anybody that they're going to be fixed. Don't tell anybody that their life is going to get easier, but we're going to let them know that positive outcomes are possible. Also, we kind of, during the engagement process, we want to get an understanding of how people view mental health and mental health treatment. What are their past experiences in mental health treatment, and how might that interfere with their experiences with social workers or police involvement? All of these things are going to inform the way that they interact with systems. We are going to ask about barriers to attendance. Are there any childcare needs? Are there transportation needs? Do they have to work while treatment is happening? And so asking these questions and finding ways to mitigate these barriers if possible, and also being very clear and transparent about what engagement in the program looks like. Also giving a clear and accurate description of the treatment that we offer, differentiating if necessary from any negative past experiences or preconceptions. So we're not going to tell anybody that they are not going to experience negativity or negative outcomes. We're never going to promise that because we don't know. But we can be transparent and concrete about the services that we offer, what the potential outcomes are, and let them know if there is any difference between the treatment that they've received previously and the treatment that they're going to receive now. So during the assessment piece, some of the suggestions are to use standardized measures to help reduce unintentional bias. And so that is something that we'll, look at during the MSc portion of our class. So standardized measures, so these might be a suicide risk assessment scale, a generalized anxiety score, a depression score, utilizing those types of things so that we can reduce bias. However, what we know about those standardized measurements is that they're not all encompassing, and how I describe my symptoms might be very different from the way that another person does. And also the Likert scale, on a scale of 1 to 10, what's your mood right now? I personally feel like these standardized measurements are a little bit too either objective or subjective. They're too specific to mean anything treatment wise, or they're not specific enough to inform us. So I think that depending on why we're using the measurement for, what we're using the measurement for. So for instance, in the ADAPT program that I work in, we take an anxiety and a depression scale at the beginning, and then we give it again at the end. Um, I think that that is an appropriate use of standardized measurements because we can see, okay, they perceived this assessment in this way, and they likely perceive it similarly at the end, so we can kind of compare the two. However, if it is, again, depending upon our role, if we're using these standardized measurements to inform our treatment plan, I don't know how appropriate that would be. So during the clinical interview, we really want to grasp a firm understanding of how they perceive the problem, what they've tried in the past to address it, if anything, what they're willing to try, and anything that they're not willing to try. We also want to talk about parenting, if that's applicable. How, what does the parent-child's relationship look like? Also understand what gender roles look like, and how that informs their lives. Any kind of discrimination experiences, migration or immigration history, any kind of an acculturation. So this is um, how has somebody had to change in order to fit into mainstream society. Also, any religious or spiritual beliefs, sexual orientation, how they view mental health treatment, and if there's a language barrier. So I'm just throwing this in here. I don't know that it is important. I don't know if it's important at this stage in our education. Um, but in order to receive Medicaid funding, all programs that receive money or are paid for services from Medicaid, they have to have accessibility to translators, and that is part of the contract that Medicaid signs with programs. And so if we have somebody who is ESL, meaning English second language, it depending on who we're working with, um, if we have access to translation services, even if we're doing the most simple assessment, I really think that it's important to utilize those services if we're able. And in some cases, it is the law. So I wanted to throw that out there. Education. So this is where we learn about the client's perspective of symptoms and clinical conditions, and then we start a discussion or a learning regarding and connecting the skills that we're going to teach in our program. And so in order for the therapy relationship to thrive, we really need to create common language, right? So when I say stressed out, we need to have, between me and the patient, we kind of have to have this universal definition of what stressed out looks like. And so when somebody comes to me and they say, oh, I'm so stressed out yesterday, my first question is like, okay, what did that look like? How did you interact with others when that happened? What did it feel like in your body? Right? So these are the kinds of questions that we need to ask, because they're going to inform the skills that we teach in the future, or what the patient is willing to do or thinks is appropriate to manage symptoms. So coping skills. So we're going to inquire about culturally accepted ways of coping. So again, that's going to look very different from this kind of Americanized way of coping. So something that I think a lot about is medication. There's kind of this idea here in the States that if you have an illness, well, there's a medication that's going to help. And that's the first step that people try to take is, okay, I'm going to see my doctor or a psychiatrist and I'm going to obtain medications. I personally think that medications should be a last case resort, depending on the diagnosis. Um, and there are cultures that do not believe in taking medication. And as a medical-based mental health facility, that's kind of the first thing that my program pushes people into, is seeing the psychiatrist, getting a diagnosis, having the medication options explained. And while my program does do that for everybody who comes in, there's also non-medication routes that we always offer for folks, and a lot of people do take them. So understanding, you know, what are what are your thoughts on medication? How have you identified, or how have you coped in the past? Um, Inquiring about how emotions are expressed culturally in the family system. Um, so, for instance, something that I experienced growing up was if my emotions weren't in alignment for what my caretaker thought they should be, like I should be happy because they bought this, or I should be sad because I got a B on my homework, whatever the case may be. Um, that is, or um, some people growing up are told that children are meant to be seen and not heard, or that, you know, whatever they were feeling was wrong. And so we really need to explore uh, those connections and those pieces in order to help inform how people are able to emotionally respond or emotionally express now. We also want to evaluate what are the risks. So the story in the book that many of you bought, the integrative assessment book, about from Japan being in a mental health program where they were asked to write their parents about their symptoms, about their experiences with mental health. And what happened was the person in this case study was actually exiled by their family, if you will, because they did not um, believe that seeking help for mental health was appropriate. And so while the program had this really good idea of how to get families involved and really explain how to feel, it actually turned on this person because culturally it wasn't appropriate to seek help. So understanding when we are asking people to engage in activities or certain types of skills in the programming, really need to explore any potential risks that could be attached to that. So now we're going to go into specific diagnoses and kind of get a broad understanding of how we can help folks cross-culturally. So the first, again, back to asking about experiences in discrimination, harassment, mistreatment. What we know about anxiety is that for whatever reason, many of us are stuck in this hypervigilant and anxious state. Um, what research shows us is that, exploring and discussing the triggers as well as the origins of anxiety is going to help take some of that power out. And so, for example, I understand you are really afraid of your house. Have you had experiences where you were treated in a frightening way because of your background? Tell me about that. Explore ways to balance exposure with realistic assessment. So, for example, a young Black youth may realistically fear encounters with police, but would still benefit from safe exposure experiences so that overall anxiety is reduced, which can help with decision making. So, we never want to tell somebody that something that they are concerned about or something that they fear is not valid. So, kind of back to that what we were talking about on the last slide about emotional neglect and how that looks. We never want to diminish or minimize somebody's experience. Me and you could go through the exact same experience, and how I perceive it and how it plays out in my life is going to look very different depending upon risk and resiliency factors, among other things. And so, um, along with people, most of our programs are going, most of us are going to work in programs that are voluntary. Um, and so that means that the patient is always going to be included on treatment planning and goal setting. And so we want to make sure that people are ready for the work. And we also want to make sure that, again, we're not diminishing and that we're validating people's experiences and people's concerns. So for depression, so we're going to find out, what does it mean to be depressed? So millions of people are depressed, and it looks very different depending from person to person, from culture to culture, from geographic location, the origins of depression. the risk factors for depression, they're going to be different across the world and across cultures. And so really understanding how we define depression and what symptoms of depression actually look like, because what we label depressive symptoms here look very different, say in a world where they don't have the same kind of economy or kind of access to services. It's going to look different. And so elicit ideas for activation that will bump up mood and take steps to solve problems or achieve goals. So again, we want to know what brings people joy, what brings people um, acceptance, and what motivates them to move, what motivates them to live, and capitalizing on these things, um, and really understanding how the culture addresses depression and how they treat folks who are going to inform our care plans. Post-traumatic stress. So I may have a diagnosis of PTSD, and so could you. Mine very well may be from a natural disaster or a car accident, whereas other folks are, potentially experiencing physical, sexual, emotional abuse. And so really honing in on the origins of the stress and how on a macro level how the community views this experience. um, there are some cultures in which if you've had sex or you've been sexually abused, um, you're inferior for whatever reason, so that may inform the work that we do with somebody. um, how we treat somebody who has PTSD from a natural disaster versus somebody who was physically abused in childhood is going to be different. Um, and so, again, just to recap, how does the community or the culture view the experience or the diagnosis? Um, what motivates or what drives this diagnosis or these symptoms? And then also addressing what the client's willing to talk about with their social supports. Are they talking, find out who they're sharing information with. Would it be a pastor, teachers, friends, and find out, and acknowledge and use these strategies to explore benefits of talking about trauma. So there are some people who are raised, we never talk about trauma, we never talk about our problems. And so again, that relationship is going to look very different. I have some folks that come in and they are upfront and ready and willing to talk about the worst things that have ever happened to them. Some people will take them to their grave. And so understanding that, and that's okay. And so understanding how the patient is interacting and living in their experiences and what they're willing to do and how far are they willing to go, um, and finding ways to navigate and be the best help possible to them regardless of their path. um, Also listening to responses that are potentially cultural collisions. So a cultural collision would occur when my informed experience and somebody else's experience were starting to go head to head because they're not in alignment. Um, and so an example that you might see in the field is blaming victims, belief that sexual abuse ruins a girl and her chances in life, or that it was just fate. So understanding how has their societal experience or culture informed the way they see the world. And we want to be careful about challenging these ideas. I think that it's important to challenge something along the lines of being ruined after we've been assaulted. But I think coming at it with grace and compassion and really understanding that these things are ingrained in us, the things that we're told growing up, we take those things with us, and they're run deep. And so I think that it's important to be really careful about how we address this ideology. explore. I'm going to leave that for you to read later. We already talked about the historical trauma among Native Americans, African Americans, and refugees. So we want to inquire about how that history plays a part in response to their current trauma. Recognize that an individual's depth of pain is informed by historical and cultural experiences, and acknowledge how this impact reactions to more and personally experienced trauma. So what we know about trauma is that the largest risk factor for trauma is trauma. And so when you come in and you have somebody who's recently or historically had a traumatic experience, there's going to be multiple, almost all of the time. And so I do, after working in the field for a while, you start to see patterns. And so understanding, no matter how uncomfortable it is, as long as we can keep the patient safe, um, getting in-depth assessment to people's trauma can inform how we treat them now. Also encourage the client to think about how to change the intergenerational legacy of trauma. So something that we see a lot is, let's take substance use, for instance. Substance use is something that runs in my bloodline. And so some people lose hope in the sense of, well, my family's always been like this. It's going to continue being this way. There's no change that I can make. So really hyper focusing on how we can break those links of intergenerational trauma or legacy, and also encouraging folks to be the change they wish to see in the world. So in summary, we don't need to buy a million books on different cultures, ethnographies, and again, if you want to, if you have the time for that, that's great. But I think really understanding fundamentally that a one size fits all, because it's evidence-based, is not going to work for, and putting an emphasis on really taking the time to get to know somebody, to get to know how they've coped historically, what they're willing to do to address their issues now, who they're willing to get help from. This is going to be learning how to ask a lot of questions is going to be, if you take anything from this, please let it be that. It's okay that we're not the expert. It's okay that we don't know everything about different cultures and the people that we serve. I know that personally, I would rather have somebody ask a lot of questions, even if it takes a long time, rather than make assumptions about me. And so, in summary, taking a culturally responsive approach can reduce disparities in access, increase engagement in effective therapies by traditionally marginalized minority groups, and make therapy a meaningful experience. And again, in addition to the reading, please, if you can't read the whole thing, feel free to skim. But also the videos for this week, especially the ones that are optional, I didn't make them mandatory, again, because there's so much content. But if you have time, please check out those optional videos. I think they're all a very important piece of the work. And I will see you in case management.